The lonely road. The night was draped in an inky blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly as David Stevens drove his cab along the winding country roads. The GPS screen on his dashboard blinked erratically, struggling to find a signal in this remote, isolated location. David had always been curious about the stories that hid in the shadows of these forgotten places, but tonight, curiosity was giving way to unease. The cabin of the taxi was a dim cocoon of warmth, contrasting sharply with the chill that seeped through the windows. David's eyes flitted to the rearview mirror more often than usual, though he tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. It was probably just his imagination playing tricks on him. He had heard the stories about people who drove through isolated places only to find themselves in situations they couldn't explain. But he was a driver, he'd seen it all, or so he thought. The first passenger of the evening had been a woman who seemed like she'd stepped out of a Gothic novel. Dressed in dark clothes, her face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She had said little during the ride, only whispering directions in a barely audible tone. When David had glanced back, her eyes were fixed on the window, unblinking. It wasn't until she left the cab at an old, dilapidated house that David noticed something odd. The air in the cab had grown colder, and a faint, sweet scent lingered long after she had departed. David shook off the shiver that ran down his spine. He had a job to do. His next passenger was a young man who looked like he had been on the run for days. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes darted nervously. He spoke rapidly about a family emergency, but when David tried to ask for more details, the man fell silent. When David finally dropped him off at a small, isolated cabin, the man's hurried "thank you" seemed laden with desperation. As the night wore on, David's unease grew. The road was getting lonelier, and the occasional flicker of headlights from passing cars seemed more like signals from another world. It wasn't long before he noticed something strange. The GPS, which had been erratic all night, now displayed a route he hadn't taken. It led through a part of the forest he didn't recognize. David's curiosity got the better of him. He decided to follow the route, thinking perhaps it was a shortcut. The road narrowed as he drove deeper into the forest, the trees leaning in as if whispering secrets to each other. The air grew colder still, and the scent from before, the sweet, almost cloying odor, seemed to return stronger this time. He reached a small clearing with a decrepit farmhouse at its center. The house looked abandoned, yet there was a light flickering inside. David's sense of unease heightened. As he prepared to turn around and head back, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. The figure was cloaked in shadow, only its eyes visible, reflecting the light of the flickering lamp. David's hands trembled as he fumbled for the gear shift. He was about to drive away when the figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be another person. A young woman with a pale face and a hollow expression. She raised a hand, gesturing for him to stop. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stopped the cab. The woman approached the window, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and urgency. Her voice, though soft, carried an intensity that made David's skin crawl. "Please, you have to help me. They're coming for me," she said, her gaze darting nervously around the clearing. David tried to remain calm. "Who's coming for you? What's going on?" The woman took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the window. "There's something wrong with this place. I don't know what it is, but it's been chasing me for days. It's everywhere I go." David glanced around, trying to see if there was anything unusual, but the clearing appeared deserted. "Look, I'll give you a ride back to town. Just get in." The woman hesitated, then nodded gratefully and climbed into the cab. As David turned the taxi around, he could feel her eyes on him, watching every move he made. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the rustling of leaves outside. The road back seemed longer than it had been coming in, and the flickering light of the farmhouse was soon out of sight. The woman occasionally muttered to herself, her words unintelligible but filled with a sense of dread. When they finally reached the nearest town, David pulled up in front of a small, run-down motel. The woman thanked him hurriedly and got out of the cab, glancing nervously over her shoulder. As she hurried inside, David saw the same figure from before standing across the street. Its eyes glowed eerily in the dark. David's curiosity was now overshadowed by a growing sense of fear. He drove back to the clearing to investigate, but found the farmhouse was now completely dark and deserted. The GPS, which had been erratic, now displayed a straight path back to the main road, but David was certain he had not deviated from the route. He decided to head back to the motel to see if the woman was still there. As he approached, he noticed a group of people standing outside, talking animatedly. They were all looking at him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. One of the men stepped forward. "Are you the driver who picked up the young woman? She didn't make it to her room." David's heart sank. "What do you mean? She got out just a few minutes ago." The man shook his head. "She's been missing for weeks. We thought she was just another lost soul, but it seems like she's returned. And now, so have you." David's confusion grew as he noticed the same eerie figure watching him from across the street, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. David's world was unraveling around him. The eerie figure had vanished, but the sense of being watched remained. The locals' murmurs grew more frantic as they explained the legend of the isolated town, a place where time and reality warped, trapping souls in an endless loop. David tried to rationalize it. The woman's disappearance could have been a coincidence, a mix-up, but the figure, the GPS, the lingering scent, all of it was too coincidental. Determined to get to the bottom of it, David decided to stay in the town overnight. He checked into the same motel where the woman had last been seen, hoping to find some clue. As night fell, the town took on an even more surreal quality. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. In the middle of the night, David was awakened by a knock on his door. He opened it to find the same young woman standing there, drenched in sweat and looking even more frightened than before. "They're after me again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how, but they found me." David's mind raced. He led her into his room and locked the door behind them. "Who's coming after you?" The woman's eyes were wide with terror. "It's not just people. Something that takes people and traps them here. I've been running from it, but I can't escape." David tried to make sense of it. "What is it? How does it work?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know, but it has something to do with this place. The people you see, they're not real. They're echoes, memories of those who've been trapped here." As she spoke, the lights in the motel flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The air grew colder, and the sweet, cloying scent returned. David's breath came out in visible puffs, and he could hear faint, whispering voices coming from outside. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the eerie figure from before stepped into the room. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and it moved with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The woman screamed and backed away, but David felt a strange calm wash over him. The figure approached, its gaze locked onto David. It reached out a hand, and David felt a strange pull, as if the figure was trying to draw him into another realm. David knew he had to confront his fear to survive. With a surge of courage, David stepped forward and faced the figure. "What do you want from us?" The figure's eyes seemed to reflect David's own fear. It spoke in a voice that echoed with 1,000 whispers. "To understand, to remember, to break free." David realized the truth. The figure was a part of the town's curse, a manifestation of the trapped soul's collective fear and confusion. To escape, he needed to confront the essence of the curse itself. With a deep breath, David reached out and touched the figure's hand. A blinding light enveloped him, and he felt himself being pulled into a vortex of swirling images and emotions. Memories, both his own and those of the trapped souls, flashed before his eyes. When the light faded, David found himself back in his taxi, the familiar hum of the engine soothing his nerves. The woman was gone, and the town was no longer there. Instead, he was driving on a smooth, well-lit road, the night sky clear and calm. The GPS had reset to its normal, reliable state, and the sweet scent had vanished. David's heart was still racing, but he was determined to make sense of what had happened. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was early morning, and he had no idea how much time had passed. The road he was on seemed familiar, leading back to a bustling city he recognized from before. David arrived in the city, the neon lights and sounds of urban life a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the isolated town. He pulled into a parking lot and sat in his cab, trying to process the events of the night. His shift was over, but sleep was elusive. He needed answers. He decided to visit the local library to research the mysterious town and its legends. The library was quiet, its old wooden shelves filled with dusty books and historical records. David scanned through books about local folklore, isolated communities, and unexplained phenomena. After hours of searching, he found an old journal tucked away in a corner of the library. It was a diary belonging to a historian who had once investigated similar occurrences in remote areas. The diary detailed a series of mysterious disappearances and sightings of ghostly figures in isolated towns. It mentioned a phenomenon known as temporal echoes, when time and reality became distorted in certain locations, trapping people in a loop of their worst fears and memories. David's heart pounded as he read. The diary described how to break free from such a curse, understanding the nature of the echo and confronting it with unyielding resolve. The figure he had encountered was a manifestation of the town's curse, feeding off fear and confusion. Armed with new knowledge, David decided to return to the area where he had encountered the strange town. He drove back through the familiar route, past the landmarks he remembered, until he reached the outskirts of the town again. It was still early morning, and the town was just as it had been before, albeit without the haunting atmosphere. He parked his cab at the edge of the clearing where the farmhouse had been. It was now a normal, empty field. He took a deep breath, steeling himself to face whatever was left of the curse. David walked to the center of the clearing and called out, "I'm here. I understand now. Show yourself if you can." There was no immediate response, but the air grew colder, and the sweet scent returned, stronger than before. The eerie figure appeared once more, its eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce through David's very soul. "Why are you still here?" David demanded. "What do you want?" The figure's voice was a haunting blend of sorrow and anguish. To be remembered, to be acknowledged, to find release. David realized that the curse wasn't just about trapping people. It was also about a deep-seated need for recognition. The souls trapped in the town wanted to be understood and remembered, not just feared. "I acknowledge you," David said firmly. "I understand your pain and your need to be heard." The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering like a dying flame. David continued, "I'll tell your story. I'll make sure people know what happened here." As David spoke, the figure's form began to dissolve, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The clearing felt warmer, the scent fading away. The curse was lifting, and the figure's eyes softened, as if expressing gratitude. David watched as the last remnants of the figure vanished, leaving the clearing empty and peaceful. He knew that the town's curse had been broken, but he also understood that it was only through confronting his own fears and acknowledging the suffering of others that he had been able to find a resolution. David drove back to the city with a sense of relief and closure. He had faced the unknown and emerged stronger for it. But as he approached his apartment, he noticed something unusual. The same figure he had seen in the clearing was now standing on his doorstep. David's heart skipped a beat. The figure's eyes were still glowing, but it seemed more familiar, less threatening. It spoke softly. "You have done well, David, but there is more to this journey." David was bewildered. "What do you mean?" The figure's form began to blur and shift. "You are not just a driver. You are a seeker, a protector of those who are lost. The journey you started is not over. There are other places, other echoes that need your help." With those words, the figure disappeared, leaving David with a newfound purpose and a sense of responsibility. He realized that his experience was not just about escaping a curse, but about a greater role he was destined to play. As he entered his apartment and closed the door behind him, David knew that his life had changed forever. The mysteries he had faced had opened his eyes to a broader world of unexplained phenomena and hidden truths. His curiosity had led him into the heart of darkness, but it had also illuminated a path forward. David took a deep breath and prepared himself for the next chapter of his journey, knowing that the road ahead would be filled with more mysteries, more challenges, and a greater understanding of the world beyond the ordinary. Months passed, and David continued his work as a taxi driver, but his experiences had transformed him. He had become more attuned to the subtleties of his passengers' stories and the oddities of his surroundings. Each ride was now an adventure, a chance to uncover the hidden layers of reality. One evening, as he drove through the city streets, a new passenger entered his cab, a young woman with an air of quiet confidence. She seemed familiar, though David couldn't place her. As they drove, she began to speak of strange occurrences and unsettling feelings, recounting tales that mirrored his own experiences in the isolated town. David listened intently, his curiosity piqued. He realized that the world was filled with echoes and mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The woman's story was just the beginning of a new chapter in his journey, a journey that would lead him to uncover more hidden truths and confront new fears. As he dropped her off, David watched her disappear into the night, a sense of anticipation and excitement building within him. He understood that his role was far from over. The path ahead was filled with unknowns, but he was ready to face whatever lay in store. The road stretched out before him, a winding journey through the realms of the unexplained. And as he drove into the night, David knew that he was not just a taxi driver. He was a seeker of truths, a guardian of the lost, and an explorer of the unseen paths that lay hidden in the shadows of the world.